The cold Montana winter of 1885 brought more than snow. It brought a ghost, a woman staggering out of the swirling white, a wailing bundle clutched to her chest. Her name was Hattie Owens, and she walked into Redwood Falls like a woman walking to her own execution. The townsfolk, huddled in the saloon and the general store, watched her through frosty windows. They'd seen desperation before. This was different. This was a secret wrapped in a blizzard. By nightfall, the whispers started. She was a widow, she claimed, seeking refuge from a cruel world. Frank Reynolds, owner of the livery stable, watched her from his doorway. He was a man carved from the frontier itself, hardened by war and cattle drives. He didn't trust stories that were too simple, and a beautiful widow appearing from a storm was the simplest story of all. For 3 days, she was just a rumor, a ghost in the town's only boarding house. Frank tried to put her out of his mind, but something about her haunted him, the way she walked, the set of her jaw. It felt familiar. Then she appeared at his stable. The wind tore at her thin coat as she stood in the wide doorway, the baby in her arms, now silent, just watching. "They say you might have work," she said. Her voice was steady, but her lips were blue with cold. Frank didn't look up from the horseshoe he was hammering. He was a man of few words, and most of them were no. "Don't hire women," he grunted. "I can keep books," she pressed, her voice cutting through the clang of steel. "My husband, he taught me figures. Your ledger on that desk looks like a chicken scratched it." He stopped hammering. He glanced at the pile of papers that served as his accounting. She wasn't wrong. He hated paperwork. He finally looked at her, really looked at her, young, worn out, but there was a fire in her eyes that defied the cold. And then he saw the baby's eyes. For a second, the world tilted. They were bright blue, a startling, piercing blue that seemed to look right through him. He felt a jolt, a flicker of a memory he couldn't quite catch. It was like seeing his own reflection in a stranger's child. He shook it off. The frontier played tricks on a man's mind. $3 a week, he heard himself say. You work in the office. The baby stays quiet or the deal's off. Relief washed over her face, so powerful it was like watching a dam break. "We start tomorrow," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds." "Frank," he corrected, surprised at himself. "Hattie," she replied, a small, fragile smile touching her lips. "And this is James." She adjusted the blanket, and Frank saw those eyes again, bright, knowing, and impossibly familiar. He turned back to the horse, his heart pounding a strange, uneven rhythm. He had a feeling he'd just hired more than a bookkeeper. He'd just let the storm inside, and he had no idea the hurricane that was coming. Winter's grip slowly loosened, and a strange peace settled over the livery stable. Hattie was a phantom of efficiency. She moved through the dusty office like a spirit, turning Frank's mess of receipts and IOUs into neat columns of black ink. The baby, James, would sit in a wooden crate beside her desk, a silent observer of this new world. Frank found himself making excuses to be in the office. He'd check on tack he knew was perfectly fine. He'd sharpen tools that were already sharp. Anything to be near the quiet hum of Hattie's work and the occasional gurgle from the baby. He started whittling a small wooden horse, telling himself it was just to pass the time. One afternoon, he dangled a strip of leather over the crate, and James erupted in a fit of giggles. The sound echoed in the quiet stable, a pure, happy noise that made Frank's chest feel tight. "He's taken a shine to you," Hattie said, not looking up from her ledger. "Kids usually do," Frank mumbled, feeling a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the forge. Hattie paused her work. "Was there ever a Mrs. Reynolds?" she asked, her voice soft. Frank's good mood vanished. He felt the old walls go up, the ones built at Antietam and hardened on the Chisholm Trail. "Almost," he said, his voice flat. "War changed that plan." He turned and walked away, the conversation over. He didn't see the flicker of disappointment in Hattie's eyes. Later that evening, as she was bundling James against the spring chill, she stopped at the door. "His father died before he was born," she said suddenly, her back to him. "A mining accident in Idaho. I was heading to my aunt in Oregon when the money ran out." The story was simple, clean, a perfect little tragedy. Frank nodded, accepting the information. He told himself it didn't matter. She was a good worker. The boy was quiet. That's all he needed to know. But as she walked out, the setting sun catching the auburn glint in her hair, he knew it was a lie. Not the whole story, anyway. There were pieces missing, dark pieces she was keeping hidden, and he was starting to feel a desperate need to know what they were. The town of Redwood Falls exploded overnight. A silver strike in the mountains turned the sleepy settlement into a frantic boomtown. The livery was swamped. Men with silver fever needed horses, wagons, and a place to store their gear. Frank and Hattie were working from sunrise to long past sunset, the stack of coins in the cash box growing taller each day. "We need help," Hattie said one night, her fingers smudged with ink as she tallied the day's earnings. "You can't do this alone." Frank knew she was right. He was bone-tired. He hired a young lad named Timothy, a strong, honest boy who took to the work quickly. The extra hands gave Frank moments to breathe, moments to watch. He'd stand in the shadows of the stable, watching Hattie play with James on a blanket under the cottonwood tree. The boy was crawling now, a determined little creature chasing after the wooden horse Frank had carved. His laughter was the soundtrack to Frank's summer. One afternoon, Frank sat on the blanket with them. James immediately crawled into his lap, pulling himself up by Frank's shirt. The boy felt solid, real. His small hands gripped Frank's calloused fingers. "Do you ever think about having a family of your own?" Hattie asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question hit Frank like a physical blow. He looked down at the boy in his lap, at those piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold a universe of secrets. "A man needs things in place for that," he answered carefully, his voice rough. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Frank paced the small apartment above the stable, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Hattie, James, the boy's eyes. It was a puzzle he couldn't solve, a lock he didn't have the key for. There was something nagging at him, a familiarity he couldn't place. It was more than just the eyes. It was the stubborn set of the boy's jaw when he was trying to stand. It was the shape of his hands. The next morning, the puzzle pieces began to slam into place. He heard raised voices from the office. Not angry, but cold, measured, dangerous. He walked in to find Hattie standing ramrod straight, her face pale. A man stood before her, a tall, thin man in a suit that cost more than Frank made in a year. He looked like a vulture, all sharp angles and predatory stillness. "I've explained, Mr. Hargrove," Hattie was saying, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm not interested." "And I've explained that your situation leaves you no choice," the man replied, his voice a silken threat. "An unmarried mother has limited options. My client is being more than generous." Frank cleared his throat. The sound was like a rock slide in the quiet office. The vulture, Hargrove, turned his head slowly, his eyes filled with annoyance. "Private matter," he hissed. "Anything that upsets my bookkeeper in my stable," Frank said, stepping forward until he was right beside Hattie, "concerns me." Hattie looked at Frank, her eyes wide with panic. "Frank, this is Mr. Hargrove. He's a lawyer. From Helena." Her voice cracked on the last word. "He represents James's paternal grandparents." The air went thin. Frank looked from Hattie's terrified face to the smug lawyer. "Thought you said the father was dead." "He is," she said, but her eyes told a different story. "Mrs. Owens has been less than honest," Hargrove said with a cruel smile. The boy's grandparents, the Blackwoods, are prepared to offer you a substantial sum to relinquish your claim. They want to give the boy the life he deserves, the life you can't provide. They're trying to buy my son, Hattie whispered, the words catching in her throat. Frank felt a cold rage settle in his gut. He looked at the lawyer, then at Hattie, and finally at the wooden crate where James was starting to whimper. He took another step forward, putting himself between Hattie and the lawyer. His voice was low, flat, and full of menace. "The boy stays with his mother," he said. "You're trespassing. Get out." Hargrove's smile tightened. He placed a business card on the desk as if it were a loaded gun. "This is not over," he said. "The Blackwoods are not accustomed to being told no. They will increase their offer. Think about what's best for the child." And then he was gone. The moment the door closed, Hattie collapsed into her chair, her body shaking uncontrollably. James, sensing her distress, began to wail. Frank didn't hesitate. He walked over, lifted the crying baby from the crate, and held him against his shoulder, rocking him gently. The boy's cries slowly subsided. "Frank, Hattie started, her voice choked with sobs. "You don't owe me any explanations," he said, his eyes on the child in his arms. "But I do," she insisted, her voice raw. "I lied to you. I lied about everything." Frank continued to soothe the baby, his touch surprisingly gentle. He didn't speak. He just waited, giving her the space to unravel the truth. He could feel the boy's small heart beating against his chest. "James's father. He didn't die in a mining accident," she finally whispered to the floor. "He's alive. I left him. He wasn't a good man." Frank's jaw tightened. The Blackwoods' son. It wasn't a question. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Charles Blackwood. His family owns half the copper in Montana. I was a teacher for the staff's children. He was charming. At first. Then he was cruel. When I told him I was pregnant, he laughed at me. He said I was trying to trap him. He said the baby couldn't be his." Frank looked down at James, who was now calmly playing with a button on his shirt. The boy looked up, and those blue eyes met his. The same eyes, the same jawline. A cold dread, mingled with something else he couldn't name, began to creep up his spine. "And was he right?" Frank asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Was he telling the truth?" "No!" she cried, her head snapping up. "James is his son, absolutely. The Blackwoods wanted nothing to do with me, with us, not until Charles's wife. She couldn't give him an heir. Now they need one. They need a Blackwood legacy." She buried her face in her hands. "They'll take him, Frank. They have money, power. I'm nobody. They'll crush me." Frank felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it stunned him. This wasn't about an employee anymore. This was about this boy, this helpless child in his arms. But it was more than that. It was about the lie. Charles Blackwood had looked at this child and said, "He isn't mine." But why? What did he see in the boy's face that made him so certain? The answer was hanging in the air, a terrible and unspoken truth. Frank looked from the boy's face to Hattie's, and the pieces of the puzzle didn't just fall into place. They exploded. That evening, Frank rode out of town like a man possessed. He didn't stop until he reached the telegraph office in the next county. He sent 3 messages, his handwriting tight and controlled. One to an old Army friend, now a hard-nosed lawyer in Helena. One to a cattle baron in Wyoming who owed him a life-or-death favor. And the last one to a U.S. Marshal he'd once ridden with for 3 weeks, hunting a man who'd made the mistake of stealing Frank's horses. He was calling in his ghosts. He was assembling an army. When he rode back into Redwood Falls, the moon was high and cold. He found Hattie sitting on the wooden steps leading up to his apartment, James sleeping in her arms. She looked small and lost in the darkness. "I was wondering where you'd gone," she said, her voice a tired whisper. "Making arrangements," he said, sitting down beside her, the wood groaning under his weight. Got some friends. They might be able to help. Why? She asked, looking at him, her eyes searching his in the dim light. Why would you do this for us? Frank stared out at the dark outline of the mountains. He could feel the weight of her question, the weight of everything unsaid between them. He had to know. He had to ask. Been thinking all day, he began, his voice rough. Something about the boy. It's familiar. He saw her tense beside him, a subtle shift in the darkness. What do you mean? Those eyes, he said, not looking at her. They remind me of someone. Her breath hitched. He could hear it, a tiny, sharp sound in the night. Frank, she started, but her voice failed her. He turned to face her, his gaze intense. Hattie, when exactly did you leave Helena? She looked away, down at the sleeping child in her arms. Last July, she whispered. Frank did the math in his head. The numbers clicked into place like the tumblers of a lock. And James was born. When? November 18th, she said, her voice almost inaudible. Making him. About 8 months old now, Frank finished for her, his own voice sounding distant, strange. The silence stretched between them, thick with the truth they had both been avoiding. It was a living thing in the darkness. Funny thing is, Frank continued, his voice low and steady, I was in Helena last April. Drove a herd up from Texas. Stayed for nearly 3 weeks waiting on payment. He let the words hang in the air. I remember a girl, a school teacher with auburn hair, at the Silver Dollar Saloon. She was with friends, celebrating her 21st birthday. Hattie's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a dawning horror and recognition. The cattle boss, she breathed. With the scar on your hand. She gestured toward the faint white line across his knuckles. You never told me your name was Hattie, he said. It's Harriet, she whispered. My friends. They called me Hattie. The confession hung between them, more powerful than any gunshot. Frank let out a slow breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. And Blackwood? He asked, his voice tight. Was he real? Yes, she nodded, tears starting to trace paths through the dust on her cheeks. Everything I told you about him was true. We were involved. When I found out I was pregnant, I went to him. I truly believed the child was his. But you weren't sure, Frank pressed, the final piece of the puzzle sliding into place. No, she admitted, her voice breaking into a sob. There was a possibility, a chance, but you were gone, just a cattle boss passing through. I never knew how to find you. Frank reached out a hesitant hand, his fingers brushing against the sleeping baby's cheek. The skin was so soft. Blackwood, he murmured, his mind reeling. He looked at this boy, and he knew. He knew James wasn't his. He was wrong, Hattie cried softly. He looked at James and saw a stranger. Frank finally looked at her, his eyes boring into hers. But he wasn't wrong. Was he, Hattie? Her tears spilled over, a silent admission of the truth she had carried alone for so long. I don't think so, she whispered, her voice choked with guilt and fear. I think James has your eyes, Frank. He has your jaw. I've known it since the moment he was born. I saw you in his face. But I was so scared. Scared you'd reject me, too. Frank felt the world shift on its axis. The tightness in his chest, the unfamiliar surge of protectiveness, the strange sense of recognition. It all made sense now. He looked down at the sleeping child, his child, and a single, world-altering word escaped his lips. My son. The words hung in the cold night air, changing everything. By sunrise, Frank was a different man. The listless livery owner was gone, replaced by a field general preparing for battle. He had a family to protect. He had a son. Here's the plan, he told Hattie over a cup of bitter coffee. When Hargrove comes back, and he will, you stall him. Say you're considering the offer. Timothy will ride out the back and get me. I'll handle the rest." His telegrams had already borne fruit. His lawyer friend and Helena confirmed their position. "Without a marriage certificate, the Blackwoods' claim is hot air," Frank explained. "They're just trying to scare you, banking on you taking the money instead of fighting a war you can't afford." "They were right," Hattie admitted, her eyes never leaving his face. "Until yesterday." A new current flowed between them. It wasn't just employer and employee anymore. It was an alliance, a partnership forged in secrets and bound by the child who slept peacefully in his crate. They talked for hours, filling in the gaps of their lives. He told her about growing up on a farm in Ohio, about the horrors of the war that had stolen his youth. She told him about the cold loneliness of the Philadelphia orphanage where she was raised, and her desperate hunger for an education, for a life of her own. They were two broken pieces of the world who had, by some impossible twist of fate, found each other in the Montana wilderness. 2 days later, the vultures descended. Hargrove didn't come alone this time. A fine carriage, pulled by 4 perfectly matched black horses, rolled into town and stopped in front of the livery. Hargrove stepped out, followed by an older couple who radiated wealth and arrogance. They looked at the dusty stable as if it were something they'd scraped off their boots. As planned, Timothy slipped out the back the moment he saw them. "Mrs. Owens," Hargrove announced, striding into the office as if he owned it. "Allow me to introduce Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood." Hattie stood frozen behind her desk, her hands clenched into fists. "So this is the hovel you've hidden our grandson in," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice dripping with disdain. "A horse stable. How utterly squalid." "My son is not hidden," Hattie said, her voice shaking but defiant. "And he is not your grandson." Mr. Blackwood, a thick, imposing man with a cruel mouth, stepped forward. "Let's dispense with the pleasantries, young woman. We are prepared to offer you $5,000, in cash, a fortune for someone like you. Take the money, sign the papers, and disappear. It's the best outcome for everyone, especially the boy." "James's rightful place is with his parents," a low voice said from the back doorway. Frank stepped into the office, his presence filling the small room. He wasn't the town's quiet stable owner anymore. He was the man who had survived Gettysburg, the man who had faced down rustlers and killers. He moved to stand beside Hattie, a silent, unmovable wall. "And you are?" "Mr. Blackwood demanded, sizing him up. "Frank Reynolds," he said, his voice calm and even. "This is my business, and this is my bookkeeper." He paused, letting the word settle. "And James Reynolds is my son." Mrs. Blackwood let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "Preposterous! The child is Charles's. Anyone with eyes can see the Blackwood features." "That's an interesting claim," Frank replied, his voice dangerously soft. "Considering your son denied paternity from the very beginning. Said it was impossible." "A misunderstanding," Hargrove interjected smoothly, trying to regain control. "Charles was simply surprised by the news. Surprised enough to throw me out of his house and threaten to have me arrested," Hattie added, her voice laced with the bitterness of her memory. Frank crossed his arms, his posture radiating a quiet, deadly confidence. "I've already been in contact with Judge Harrison in Helena," he said, the lie rolling off his tongue as smoothly as the truth. "He's an old friend. He's expecting us tomorrow to file the legal documentation of my paternity. U.S. Marshal Wilson has kindly offered to escort us, just to ensure there are no misunderstandings on the road." Hargrove's smug expression faltered. He knew the name. Judge Harrison was a legend, a man known for his iron will and his intolerance for the games of the rich. "You know Judge Harrison?" "Served together at Gettysburg," Frank said, the lie now taking on a life of its own. "He took a bullet for me. I figure he owes me a favor." Mr. Blackwood's face turned a mottled shade of red. "This is absurd. We will not be intimidated by some backwater stable owner and his fabricated stories." "I'm not trying to intimidate anyone," Frank said evenly. "I'm just protecting my family." "Family?" Mrs. Blackwood sneered, the word like poison on her lips. "You expect us to believe you've married this woman?" It was the final move in a desperate chess game. Frank looked at Hattie, at her pale, determined face. He saw her future, their son's future, hanging in the balance. He took a breath. "Not yet," Frank said, his words shocking everyone in the room, including Hattie. "But we've made arrangements. Reverend Thomas is marrying us in the morning, right before we leave to see the judge." Hattie's eyes widened, but she didn't miss a beat. She lifted her chin, her gaze locking with Mrs. Blackwood's. "As my future husband said," she stated, her voice clear and strong, "we are simply protecting our son." The standoff was absolute. The air crackled with tension. The Blackwoods, for the first time in their lives, were faced with something their money couldn't buy and their power couldn't crush. Hargrove leaned in and whispered furiously in Mr. Blackwood's ear. The older man's face shifted from rage to cold, hard calculation. "Perhaps," Mr. Blackwood said finally, his voice tight with fury, "we have been hasty. If the child is not of Blackwood blood, then we, of course, have no claim." "And no interest," his wife added, her eyes like chips of ice. "We will require proof, of course," Hargrove insisted, trying to save face. "Documentation of this arrangement." "You'll have it," Frank promised. "Now, if you'll excuse us. We have a wedding to prepare for." He watched them go, the powerful family retreating in their fancy carriage, defeated. The moment they were out of sight, Hattie turned to him, her eyes a mixture of disbelief, terror, and something else he couldn't quite read. "Marriage?" she whispered. "Tomorrow?" Frank's bravado evaporated. He felt like a man standing on a cliff edge. "It was the first thing that came to my mind," he stammered. "A bluff. We don't have to. We just needed to get them to back down." "Oh," Hattie said, her face becoming an unreadable mask. "Of course. A bluff." She turned away, and the silence in the office was suddenly more deafening than the confrontation had been. That evening was the longest of Frank's life. Hattie worked in silence, her movements stiff and precise. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. As she packed up to take James back to the boarding house, Frank knew he couldn't let her leave. Not like this. He paced the office, his boots loud on the wooden floor. Finally, he blocked her path to the door. "Hattie," he began, his voice rough, "about what I said earlier." "It was clever," she said, not looking at him. "It worked. They're gone." "It wasn't just a bluff," he admitted, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. "Not all of it. I've been thinking about it, even before today." She went still, her back ramrod straight. "What do you mean?" He struggled. "I've grown fond of you, Hattie, more than fond. I know it hasn't been long, but life is different out here. You make decisions faster. You have to." She finally turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face in the fading light. "Are you proposing to me, Frank?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. He took off his hat, twisting the brim in his hands like a nervous boy. "I'm doing a poor job of it, seems like. But yes, I am. It would give James my name, properly. It would give you protection, security, if you want it." "Because you feel obligated?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Because of James?" "No," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Because I think we could build something good. It started with James, I won't lie. Seeing him, knowing he was mine, it woke something up in me. But it's more than that now. At least, it is for me." She studied him for a long moment, her expression guarded. I need to know something first, she said. And I need you to be honest. If he wasn't yours, if James really was Charles Blackwood's son, would you still be standing here? Would you still be asking me to marry you? The question was a knife, cutting straight to the heart of it all. Frank thought about it, truly thought about it. I can't say for certain what I would have done, he answered slowly, honestly. But I know I was already feeling something. Before all this, I'd watch you with him, under the tree, and I'd wonder what it would be like, to be a part of that. So, maybe yes, eventually. Her guarded expression softened, the hard lines around her eyes easing. All I've ever wanted was security, she whispered. Someone kind, someone dependable. Not very romantic reasons, Frank said, a hint of disappointment in his voice. No, she agreed. She took a step closer, closing the space between them. But this is. She rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was a hesitant, gentle kiss. But for Frank, it was like a lightning strike. Something inside him that had been dead for years, something he thought the war had killed forever, roared back to life. His arms went around her waist, pulling her tight against him as the kiss deepened, becoming something hungry and desperate and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. "Is that a yes?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She smiled, a real, radiant smile that lit up the dusty office. "Yes, Frank Reynolds," she said. "That's a yes." Frank was a man of his word. The next morning, with the sun barely cresting the mountains, he had Reverend Thomas waiting in the small-town chapel. Timothy, beaming like he'd won the lottery, stood as their witness, holding a surprisingly calm James. The vows were simple, the words plain and honest, spoken in the quiet of the morning. By noon, they were in Helena, standing before Judge Harrison. The judge wasn't an old war buddy, but he was a fair man. He listened to their story, his face impassive as he reviewed the marriage certificate Frank had procured. He looked from Frank to Hattie, and then down at James, who was chewing on Frank's finger. A small smile touched the judge's lips. "The Blackwoods won't challenge this," he declared, stamping the paternity documents with a heavy, final thud. "Their pride won't allow the scandal. I received a telegram this morning. It seems Charles Blackwood and his wife have departed for an extended tour of Europe. Convenient." As they walked out of the courthouse and into the bright Montana sun, Hattie slipped her hand into Frank's. It felt right. "What now?" she asked, squinting up at him. "Now," he said, a slow grin spreading across his face. The word felt new and full of possibility. "Reckon we go home." Their return to Redwood Falls was the beginning of everything. Frank immediately started converting his small apartment above the stable into a real home. He knocked down a wall, building a separate room for James. He installed a new cast-iron stove for Hattie. The sound of his hammer echoed through the livery, a rhythm of creation, of a future being built nail by nail. The town buzzed with gossip, of course, but it was a quiet, accepting kind of buzz. On the frontier, people understood practical arrangements. The stoic stable owner and his capable bookkeeper, raising a child together. It made a certain kind of sense. But what happened behind their closed door was anything but practical. The spark that had ignited between them in a dusty saloon in Helena, the spark they had both tried to ignore, now blazed into a steady, warming fire. Theirs was a love built not on poetry and whispered promises, but on shared purpose, mutual respect, and a fierce, unspoken gratitude. "Never imagined this," Frank confessed one night, his voice a low rumble in the darkness of their new bedroom. James was sleeping soundly in the next room. "A family, a wife. After the war, I figured that part of my life was over." Hattie traced the old scar on his shoulder, a raised white line from a piece of shrapnel at Antietam. "I thought the same after Charles," she whispered. "I thought it would just be me and James against the whole world." "Not anymore," Frank promised, his arm tightening around her. "Never again." As summer bled into a golden autumn, their life found its rhythm. Frank taught Hattie how to ride a gentle mare, his laughter booming as she clung to the saddle horn. In the evenings, she would read to him from books she'd somehow managed to keep through all her troubles, her voice filling the small apartment with tales of Dickens and Shakespeare while he carved a growing menagerie of wooden animals for James. The boy thrived. He was the center of their universe. His first word was horse. His second was papa. He took his first wobbly steps across the stable office, his arms outstretched toward Frank, a look of pure triumph on his face. With every milestone, Frank felt his heart crack open a little wider. Then, one day in October, opportunity came knocking. An old rancher named Silas Morgan was selling his spread, a beautiful piece of land just outside of town. "Getting too old for these winters," he told Frank over a whiskey. 500 acres, good house, river runs right through it. It's yours for a fair price." Frank went home that night with a thoughtful look in his eye. "What would you think," he asked Hattie as she patched one of James's shirts, "about moving, getting some land, a real house?" She looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "Silas Morgan's place?" News traveled fast in a small town. "Might be good for James," he said, trying to sound casual. "Room to run. I could hire a full-time manager for the livery, start raising my own herd, get back to working cattle." She saw the truth in his eyes, the longing for open spaces. "You miss it," she said softly. "Part of me does," he admitted. "But I wouldn't go on the long drives, not anymore. I'd be right here, building something, for us." 2 weeks later, the deed was signed. They were the new owners of what they christened Reynolds Ridge. The house was a 2-story marvel with real glass windows and a porch that wrapped all the way around. The first time Hattie stepped inside, she burst into tears. "Our home," she whispered, standing in the middle of the empty living room, the word filled with a history of longing. "Our home," Frank confirmed, with James perched securely on his shoulders, looking around with wide, curious eyes. Life on the ranch was harder, but it was a good kind of hard. Frank's days were longer, filled with the sweat and strain of mending fences and tending to his new herd. Hattie, with the help of a young woman from the nearby Crow Reservation, learned the rhythms of a frontier household, from canning vegetables to making soap. But no matter how tired they were, they ended every day the same way. They would sit on the porch swing, watching the sun bleed across the sky, painting the mountains in shades of purple and orange. James would play at their feet, a small, happy king in his new kingdom. "Think we're doing right by him?" Frank asked one evening, watching James meticulously arrange a line of pebbles on the porch steps. "He's happy, Frank," Hattie said with a certainty that warmed him to the bone. "He's safe. He knows he's loved. What more could any child want?" Frank's expression grew serious. "Been meaning to ask you something." "What's that?" He hesitated, a rare sight. Would you want more? Children, I mean. For James. Brothers or sisters?" Hattie's face broke into a smile so bright it could have outshone the sunset. "Oh, Frank," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I would like that very much. Growing up in the orphanage, I always dreamed of having a big family." A mischievous glint appeared in Frank's eye. "Might take some practice," he suggested, his voice a low drawl. Hattie blushed, a lovely shade of pink. "Mr. Reynolds," she feigned shock, "are you attempting to seduce your wife on the front porch?" "Considering it strongly," he confirmed, leaning in to kiss her. The sound of hoof beats interrupted them. Frank was on his feet in an instant, his body instinctively shielding Hattie. He relaxed when he saw it was Timothy, riding hard up the lane to the house. "Mr. Reynolds!" the boy shouted, waving a yellow piece of paper. "A telegram! Just came in from Helena. It's important." Frank took the paper, his face grim. Telegrams rarely brought good news. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the brief, clipped words. Hattie watched him, her heart pounding. She saw his expression change, shifting from tension to something she couldn't decipher. Shock? Relief? "Frank," she whispered. "What is it?" He looked up from the telegram, his eyes meeting hers. "It's from my lawyer friend," he said, his voice flat. "Charles Blackwood is dead. Died in London. Some kind of fever, they're saying. Unexpected." The news hung in the air between them. The ghost that had haunted them was finally gone. The telegram contained more news. The Blackwoods, in their grief, were formally relinquishing any and all potential claims on James. Enclosed with the message was a bank draft for $1,000. "A gesture of goodwill," the lawyer had written, "to ensure the matter remains permanently closed." "Blood money," Hattie said, a bitter taste in her mouth as she looked at the draft. "Or an inheritance," Frank countered, his voice pragmatic, "a way to build his future, buy more cattle, expand the ranch." He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the twilight. "It's his birthright in a way, just not from the family he truly belongs to." Hattie nodded slowly. It felt like justice. A strange, complicated kind of justice. That night, as the first snow of the season began to fall, dusting the world in a blanket of silent white, they lay in bed, the warmth of their bodies a fortress against the cold. "I never thought I'd be grateful to Charles Blackwood for anything," Hattie murmured against his chest. "But if it wasn't for him, if I hadn't been running from him, I never would have found my way back to you." "We would have found each other eventually," Frank replied, his voice filled with a quiet certainty that settled deep in her soul. "Some things are just meant to be." Christmas came, and with it, a gift Frank never expected. After they had exchanged their modest presents, a leather-bound journal for her, a silver pocket watch for him, Hattie took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "There's one more," she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "This one should arrive around July." Frank stared at her, his mind struggling to catch up. He looked from her radiant face to his hand resting on her belly. Understanding dawned, and with it came a wave of pure, unadulterated joy, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. "Are you sure?" he breathed. She nodded, a single happy tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday. We're having a baby, Frank." He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, his own eyes burning. "Thank you," he whispered, the words thick with all the emotion he could never properly express. "Thank you for everything." Outside, the Montana winter raged, but inside the small ranch house, a family was growing, built on secrets and lies, but forged into something stronger than steel by love and truth. James slept peacefully in his room, surrounded by the wooden animals his father had carved and the warm quilts his mother had stitched. He was a child of chance, a boy who had brought two lost souls together, all because of a truth he carried in his eyes. As the new year of 1886 dawned, Frank stood at the bedroom window, watching the sunrise turn the snow-covered fields to gold. Hattie and James were still asleep, their breathing soft and even in the quiet room. He thought about the impossible journey that had led him to this moment, a chance encounter in a saloon, a desperate woman appearing out of a storm, a flash of recognition in a child's blue eyes that had changed the course of his life forever. She had told him the boy wasn't his. The world had told him the boy wasn't his. But he had known. The moment he truly looked, he had seen himself, And in that instant, he had found a reason to fight again. He had found a purpose. He had found a home. He turned from the window and looked at his wife and his son, sleeping peacefully in the morning light, and he knew with a certainty that settled into the very marrow of his bones that his wandering was finally over. If you enjoyed this story of frontier justice and hidden truths, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the next strange tale we have in store.